Alright, Chapter 5, Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution. This chapter is more important than Chapter 4, but not as important as Chapters 2 and 3. Kind of gives it a nice overview, and it hits some of the high points, and we're going to talk about those, of things that you will be tested on for your Unit 1 test, definitely. Very specific things, and I'll even point those out. And also things that are hit pretty much every single year on the AP test. All right, so it talks about it starts talking about just the birth rate of colonial America and how it was really unparalleled to the rest of the world at this time. And in the last chapter we talked about, especially in New England, but also in some of the other areas, because you're eating well, because for the most part you're healthier. There's not these huge epic world wars that are affecting killing off people. Um, you're having big families in the colonies. And so your book talks about that the colonists were doubling their numbers every 25 years, and almost solely is because of natural fertility. Obviously there's a lot of immigration, both forced and voluntary, coming into the colonies, but it really was through the birth rate that the population boom is happening. You can even see that nowadays in third world countries, right? In third world countries, before a country gets settled in, um, once food and medicine get to a certain level, the population absolutely booms, because the population is used to having so many of their kids die off and so many of their young men and women die off that it just becomes part of the culture to have these gigantic families, because you know that most of them are going to die. Well, that culture persists even after there's adequate food and medicine for a generation or two. And so what you have then is, instead of those kids and those young people dying off, they stay alive. And what you see is, what you saw in the colonies during this time period, is the population absolutely explodes. So I found this chart, and it's it starts a little bit after this chapter. You can see the earliest date there is 1810, but it shows there that there are 7 births per woman for an American woman during this time period, and then it very, very steadily goes down. Right, it goes down, down, down until you get 2 births per woman in the 1930s, and then you can see the baby boom that happens there in the aftermath of World War II, where it went up to 4 births per woman, and then it kind of goes right back down to do 2 births per woman, and that's because America becomes a much more settled place, right? And so it becomes the cultural norm then to have fewer and fewer children, as because they're not going to die off. But back during the time period of this chapter, we weren't there yet, and so you're having huge birth rates, and as a result, a huge population bloom. Mingling of the races. The biggest race that's kind of talked about during this portion of the chapter are the Scotch-Irish. They're called Irish, but they're not really Irish. If you remember from world history, the Ireland was essentially a colony of Great Britain, and after the break between Catholicism and Protestant in the Anglican Church in England, the Irish really hated the British. They already hated them because they didn't own the land, and the British owned the land. But now, because of the religious thing, it really set off. So there's a lot of fighting that's going on between the peasants of Ireland and Great Britain. And so what Great Britain did is they stuck the Scotch, right? It's Scotch, they come from Scotland in the north part of the British Isle there. They were Protestant, and they were more loyal, I guess you'd say, than the Irish, but not as loyal, obviously, as the English. And basically, the British government stuck a bunch of the Scotch in Ireland. And then there was huge fighting, and it's fighting even today. I mean, that's the whole beef in Northern Ireland, and between Northern Ireland and regular Ireland, between the Greens and the Oranges and the Protestants and the Catholics. It's a fight between Irish Catholics and the descendants of the Protestant Scotch-Irish. Well, many of those Scotch-Irish also immigrated to the American colonies, and they were very poor, and so they were really they were the original poor white trash. The back country, the mountain men, those types of things. Eventually we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, who's a descendant of the Scotch-Irish. But they take the Scotch-Irish are the cause, really, of two early rebellions. The Paxton Boys, 1764. They were in Pennsylvania, and very, very similar to Bacon's Rebellion. The causes are almost exactly the same. Remember in Bacon's Rebellion, Bacon was upset that Berkeley was being too kind, that the House of Burgesses, that the Virginia leadership were being too kind, too lenient towards the Indians. Well, the Scotch-Irish, who were essentially living on Indian land, were also pissed off that the Quaker oligarchy, the Quaker leadership, were too nice to the Indians. The Regulator movement, a little bit south in North Carolina, this is kind of your stereotypical poor versus rich, the have-nots versus the haves. This is total Zen stuff. The Regulator movement is basically that the Western backcountry Scotch-Irish were pissed off that the Eastern, more rich non-Scotch-Irish, they dominated everything, right? They dominated the government. They got to control the prices. Because you've got to remember, there were no roads. So the only time you're going to be able to sell stuff is usually through rivers, right? Because you couldn't transport anything otherwise. And the rivers, for the most part, they flowed from west to east, and you're always trying to get your goods to the ocean anyway. And so if you live along the coast, you get to dictate the prices to the more inland folk. So it causes friction. And then your book also talks about that even though that the vast majority of people in the colonies were Anglo-Saxons, that being of basically English descent, the English colonies at this time even were the most ethnically mixed people or country anywhere in the world. So it was a melting pot even back then. This shows the immigrant groups and approximately where they're migrating to in the colonies. You can see the Scotch-Irish are in the green, so they're along the Appalachian Mountains there in south central Pennsylvania, a little bit in Virginia there in the west, and then a lot in North Carolina and South Carolina. This shows percentages, and you can see that, well, I guess it wasn't vast majority. 49% of the population was English, 19% of the population was African, 7% Scottish, 7% German. Scotch-Irish, even though they caused a lot of problems, they were only 5% of the population. What's unique, and if you look here, the Irish are only 3%. These are Catholic, ethnic Irish. And it was a very, very small percent. There wasn't a whole lot of Irish people living in the colonies. That's going to change once we get to the 1830s, 40s, 50s, after the potato famine. You can see the same thing with the Germans. That's going to change once we get past 1848. And then there's some you don't even see on here at all, like the Polish, the Greek, the Italians. Those are going to really jump, those percentages, right around 1900 or so, between 1890 and about 1910. And it's because of these different world events that cause people to migrate to the United States. And then obviously recently, you don't see, on this chart you don't see Mexican at all. And yet the Mexican population are immigrating in ever greater numbers in modern times. Another interesting point is if you look up here at African, 19% of the population. That's actually the highest it ever was. Currently, African Americans are approximately 12 to 13% of the population. So the percentage has actually dropped since our nation's founding. That's something that most people think quite the opposite has happened. All right, the structure of colonial society. It was, we talk about the American dream, that even if you're poor, if you work hard and you're smart, you can become rich. And some people have said it's a myth, like Howard Zinn. Other people like Schweikart think that that's the absolute truth. Your book sides a little bit with Schweikart on this side, and they basically say that unlike the rest of the world, where you were bound to your class based on your last name and where you were born, that in America during the colonial times, even a former indentured servant, if he was smart and worked hard, he could become wealthy himself. He himself could own indentured servants. The South also had this kind of unique. It was really kind of not unique actually. It was an old world system where the large slave owners gathered more and more and more of the wealth in society, and as a result, there becomes a bigger gap between the poor whites and the rich whites. And the poor whites, slowly but surely, were getting poorer and poorer until they couldn't even own their land anymore, and they would actually end up becoming tenant farmers. So in other words, they would rent land from the rich slave-owning class. This is an ad for the slave trade. You can see spelling wasn't standardized until the 1800s, so oftentimes you'll see what looks like an F is actually an S. What you notice here, if you look, they talk about that they've been kept free from danger of being infected from smallpox. They talk about quarantining here from Charlestown. And then the small fine print at the very bottom, it says full 1/2 of the above Negroes have had smallpox in their own country. That was, and we're going to talk about a little bit later in this lecture, smallpox was still a huge danger. Remember, it basically wiped out almost all of the Native Americans in the New World itself. Even the white immigrants had a chance of dying to a large degree from the smallpox. And obviously Africans did as well. So the thing is, though, is once you were infected with smallpox, if you survived, then you were immune. So it was actually good, if you're a slave owner, to purchase a slave who had already had smallpox and survived. And if not, then you want somebody who hasn't been exposed to it, because you don't want to buy him and then he gets sick and dies. Alright, they talk about the three of the more common professions during this time period. And those are clerics, physicians, and jurists. Clerics being a minister, someone of the cloth. And that was by far the most honored profession in America during this time period. As far as physicians were not liked at all. They weren't really respected. But they were kooks. They didn't really have knowledge of germs or viruses or bacteria or cleanliness of stuff like that. They didn't actually perform most surgeries. They were actually barbers, the same dudes who would cut your hair. They did that. And as I said, epidemics were very scary and common in especially urban areas. And 1 out of 5 persons during this time period got smallpox. Basically, what a physician would do was do something called a bloodletting, and that's where they would drain your blood. And sometimes that in and of itself would kill you. We're going to talk several chapters from now that one of the presidents that we had that was assassinated, he didn't die from the assassin's bullet. He died from all the bloodletting that was happening. Lawyers, near and dear to our hearts. They were disliked as troublemakers even back then. And there's the funny quote from your book, and it's even made its way into a question on the AP exam, is that a Connecticut law actually put them in the same class as drunkards and pimps, basically, brothel keepers. Alright, and talk about how you made money outside of those 3 trades, basically. By far the most popular one was agriculture. Almost everybody in America was involved in it in some way, shape, or form. Your book states that 90% of the population was involved in agriculture. And because the land was so good, because even with mercantilism, Americans had a higher standard of living than anywhere else in the world during this time period. The other big trade was triangular trade. Now, you guys talked about this last year in world history. It was extremely profitable because of the 3 legs, that's the triangle aspect, of the voyage. you would make a big profit for each leg of the trip. And so it usually, and there's lots of different ways it would work, but the the triangle trade that we're going to talk about for this class, a ship would leave, we'll say New England, filled with rum. It would set sail for the west coast of Africa. The ship would sell the rum to the Africans on the coast, make a profit, make a very large profit. Using some of that profit, but not all, they would purchase Africans. Remember, the Africans on the coast usually acted as slave or middlemen from the interior. And so they would purchase Africans and then sail for the West Indies, okay, perhaps Cuba. That was a large slave destination. And then the ship would sell the Africans in Cuba, again making a very large profit. And then using some of that money, but not all of that money, the ship would purchase molasses, sail for New England, sell it for another big profit, where it would be distilled into rum, and then boom, it would just continue. So the same ship could just keep going over and over and over again, and each time it would make a sale at one of these ports, it would return a big profit, and then invest some of it into the next leg. All right, the Molasses Act. So we talked about this triangular trade, and in and of itself was illegal under British law oftentimes. And here's why. So Americans were growing by population, as we already talked about. This means that more and more Americans want to buy stuff. And under mercantilism, they could only buy stuff from the British. The British, however's population had already had their growth spurt 100, 200 years before this. And so their population was growing slower. And so there wasn't as much or as many British to purchase American goods. So there was always lots of demand for British goods, which means that British goods are expensive. But the demand for American goods, remember the price of tobacco from a couple chapters back, wasn't very high. And so what Americans wanted to do is they wanted more customers out there. And so they wanted to sell to countries and people besides the British. This would allow them to charge higher prices because the other countries and people wanted these American goods. So, of course, Britain would be happy to sell to the French, to the Germans, to the Russians, but as long as you used a British middleman, because then Britain would get the big profits. The Americans, of course, didn't want to do this. They wanted to sell to these other countries directly. Britain, of course, says no. They passed the Molasses Act. It's one of the navigation acts that we've already talked about. This one was passed in 1733. And it basically was an attempt to stop trade between the Americans and the French West Indies. And of course, this is the time of salutary neglect. So even though they passed the act, they didn't really enforce it. And so Americans basically bribed and smuggled their way around the law. And really no one saw any problem with this whatsoever. This is just an example of the different shipping and fishing operations. Kind of dumb. These are the different industries in the colonies at the time. You can see a couple distilleries up here by Boston. Obviously, fishing was very important in the New England area. You got cattle and grain up here in green. You got tobacco here in brown. And you have rice and indigo here in the south. You also have some, mining going on during this area here, but lots of lumber. Most of the British ships got their lumber from the American colonies. In fact, most of the ships were built by American colonial shipbuilders. You can see here the Proclamation Line of 1763, which we're going to talk about in 2 chapters. Something to keep in the back of your head for now. Here's triangle trade. All right, and I said that for our purposes, we're more concerned about this one. That goes from, we'll say in this case, New York to Africa to the West Indies back to New York. That's our triangle trade. So you got rum going this way to Africa. You got slaves going from Africa to Cuba, and then molasses going from Cuba to New England. All right, the different churches. There's the Anglican Church, right? This is the Church of England. This is, don't even think Puritans. This is the official Church of England, and in the South, especially, you see Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Um, that was the official, the tax-supported church. There was no separation between church and state. There was an official church in these colonies. And these were the colonies that were, I don't want to say most loyal, but they were the ones that were founded for economic reasons, not really religious reasons. Um, then you have here the Congregational Church. Remember the Congregationalists? These were the Puritans who eventually founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And you have here, it's Massachusetts, and at this time Maine was part of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire. And then you kind of get the rogue colonies where they really didn't have an established church. Remember Rhode Island, which Roger Williams established as a haven for everybody. New Jersey, which had lots of Swedes, and it was a very ethnically diverse. Delaware, which was kind of a renegade colony, and of course Pennsylvania, which was run by the Quakers prior, and so they had established a long history of religious toleration for all. How many people were members of each churches? And so you see here that even though that many of the colonies were Anglicans, that most of the people, because it was, you had high densities of population, especially in Massachusetts, that the largest number of people that belonged to a religion were actually the old Puritan Congregationalists. You see, at this time, there's a relatively small number of Quakers, even though we've talked about so many of them. And then here's the thing that affects Mount Carmel the most are Catholics. And you can see there were very, very low numbers of Catholics. We were not founded at all as a Catholic country. And in fact, for a huge portion of our nation's history, most of the country actually looked down their noses at Catholics. We're going to talk once eventually we get to Kennedy. Kennedy, when he was campaigning for president, had to bend over backwards to prove to the American population that he was actually going to act independent of the Pope. Everybody thought that he was just going to do whatever the Pope told him because he was Catholic. So, it's kind of funny. Alright, the Great Awakening. You need to know about the Great Awakening. I guarantee you will be tested on it on the unit test. I guarantee you there will be several questions about the Great Awakening on the AP test in May. We actually have two Great Awakenings in our nation's history, and this is the first one. The second one happens in the 1840s, so we'll talk about it a couple months from now. But what the Great Awakening is a religious revival that starts in the 1730s and 1740s. And it was basically entertainment, for lack of a better term, although it was very religious and people had very devout, fervent religious beliefs. But what you started to have were these preachers who would go to these villages and they would basically set up camp almost and start preaching. And people would flock from all over to hear these famous preachers speak. George Whitefield is a big one, and then I have here down at the bottom of the screen Jonathan Edwards was a big one. And because it was based primarily on just the charisma of these ministers, if you were a Baptist, you could kind of have your own spin on the Bible, and if you got a big enough flock, boom, you kind of created your own religion. It's a splinter group from the Baptists. And so the same thing with the Methodists and the Anglicans. What you end up having is a large split. Tons and tons and tons of new Protestant denominations are created, primarily on just the charisma and individual ideology of the ministers themselves. And I have here is the first spontaneous mass movement of the American people. It wasn't just a New York thing, a Massachusetts thing. It kind of spread all throughout the colonies, and it really it helped destroy the boundaries that the colonists felt towards each other, and it was kind of a bridge building, in essence, that the Virginians felt like they had something in common with the North Carolinians and the Marylanders and stuff like that. That they just didn't just view themselves as Virginians. Jonathan Edwards, probably the most famous of the Great Awakening preachers. He was a fire and brimstone preacher. Uh, he basically said that God hates you, or if you're lucky, God is indifferent as to your existence. His most famous sermon is titled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." There's a little excerpt in your book where it talks about that God actually dangles you over the pit of hell, and the only reason why he doesn't release you is because you are so insignificant to him that he doesn't even care enough to let go. Um, so it was some pretty pretty nasty stuff actually. But if you're just a farmer and all you do is hang out with your cows, and this guy comes to town and start preaching this stuff, it's pretty entertaining stuff. So you become a follower. There's George Whitefield. You can see everybody gathered around. Some dude without a head there, obviously drinking a beer or handing a beer off. Alright, there's Princeton. Look how glorious it is. 1764. You start to see during this second half of the 1700s, a lot of the Ivy League colleges that we know today are founded, and almost all of them are founded for religious reasons. What I mean is they're created to train the future ministers. In often cases, they're created because this religious revival of the Great Awakening creates a need for more and more preachers to bellow some of this fire and brimstone stuff that's coming out, because church membership goes way up. There had been a lull. Obviously, when the Puritans came over, they were big time religious zealots, to use the Mount Carmel term, and then as the next generation, the generation after that, they become less and less religious. Remember, the Puritans try and fix that with the halfway covenant. It doesn't really work. In fact, it probably was counterproductive, because it weakened the religious bonds, and then boom, the Great Awakening happens, and all of a sudden everybody's going to church again. So these different denominations wanted to capitalize on that, and so in order to stoke the fire, they create new religious institutions. Those are the colleges. So here we have Harvard, which we talked about before. That's absolutely ancient, 1636, and it's a congregational denomination. Yale, its counterpart, is a congregational denomination. And then you get Princeton, which is Presbyterian. Pennsylvania, of course, they don't, because of the Quakers, the denomination is non-existent. Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, you got an Anglican, a Baptist, a Dutch Reformed. Right? Alright, in the provincial culture section of this chapter, really the only thing I think that you need to know about is Ben Franklin and Poor Richard's Almanac. So Ben Franklin obviously is a gigantic figure in American history. He's a very old man by the time the Revolution rolls around, and he still is kicking butt and doing very important things. But for most of his life, what he did is he basically ran, I guess you could call it a newspaper. I mean, most of you guys probably don't know what an almanac is, but it was basically like a booklet that was distributed periodically, and it talked about when there'd be full moons, new moons, when's a good time to plant. Basically, it helps farmers kind of plan what to do during the year and when to do it according to the calendars, because there wasn't a whole lot of you didn't have weathermen back then, right? You didn't have stuff to tell you what dates would be good to do stuff. And so this was like a booklet that was passed around, or sold, I should say, of advice. And included were a bunch of sayings that Benjamin Franklin wrote. And it was like his advice. They were kind of like really ancient, old-fashioned internet picture memes. Kind of those kind of funny sayings that kind of strike close to home and actually give kind of important advice. And some of the sayings here are, there are no gains without pains. So this is the origination of the no pain, no gain saying. At a working man's house, hunger looks in but does not dare enter. So if you work, you won't go hungry. Think John Smith, he who does not work shall not eat. Industry pays debts while despair increases them. So work hard and you'll get out of debt. Bitch about it, you get more debt. Right? Diligence is the mother of good luck. God gives all things to industry. So it's a lot of like, work hard, don't worry, don't sweat the small stuff. It'll be okay type stuff. This is just a picture of Yankee workmanship. Ooh, look at the fancy woodworking and art. Sometimes your book puts stupid stuff in these. This was a a device that if you turn the crank there on the upper right hand side, it would create electricity. Remember Benjamin Franklin's the one that discovered the connection between electricity and lightning. Well, this crank, then obviously there's wires or probably early copper tubes that were attached there to that table, and you could feel the electricity if you held on to these metal rods. And supposedly it was probably just something that you'd get drunk, and some guy would have this at his house and be like, "Hey, check this out." Once everybody got drunk at a party, and everybody was like, "Woo, cool." But they claimed that it would help for different ailments and stuff like that. But I think it was basically just a cool gadget that people did. What I don't understand here is if you look at the lower right hand corner, just randomly have this dog pissing on a book, and I have no idea why. Pioneer presses. This section of the book you have to know about the Zenger trial. The Zenger trial, and I'll jump right to the end, it really establishes the precedent for freedom of the press. So this guy, Peter Zenger, he had a newspaper in the 1730s, and he basically wrote a bunch of editorials attacking the royal governor, claiming that the royal governor was corrupt. And he was right. The royal governor was corrupt. Well, of course, the royal governor doesn't like this, and so he has the authorities arrest Zenger, and he's put on trial with seditious libel. Seditious means like treasonous, and libel means stuff to attack your character in writing. Okay, so there's defamation, libel, stuff like that. Zenger argued that he wrote the truth, and the judge, of course, the judge is going to be put in place by the royal governor, says that it doesn't matter if it's truthful. The mere fact of printing it is libelous, and told the jury that you're supposed to ignore that it's true, and that's enough to convict him. The jury, who was not appointed by the royal governor, that was actually kind of his peers, if you want to think of a jury of your peers, returned a verdict of not guilty. And so it sets the precedent for freedom of the press, and it also, your book says, for democracy. And I guess they mean that a group of people decided his fate as opposed to an arbitrary judge or royal governor. Politics. This is a lot of Zen stuff in this chapter, where it talks about the people who are living out west. And really out west is only about 100 miles west of the Atlantic coast. But to people who are living in the woods and the Appalachian Mountains, they were very poor. They're the ones living on Indian country. They're the ones who, if they can sell their goods at all out east, they have to basically take what the Easterners give them as far as money. All of the cities are right on the East Coast. All the big plantations are on the East Coast. And so that's where the rich people lived. And so from a political standpoint, these colonial legislatures and assemblies, they were represented, first of all, they're located on the East Coast, and they're also represented by people, the rich people on the East Coast. And so they passed laws that benefited them, and that didn't benefit the people who were living out west. And so the poor Westerners resented this. And you can see this in the rebellions that are taking place during this time period. Bacon's Rebellion talks about this. The Paxton Boys talks about this. The Regulator Movement directly talks about this. Eventually, a few chapters from now, we're going to talk about Shays' Rebellion, which deals with this, and then the Whiskey Rebellion, which deals with this. So all of these early rebellions during colonial times, and then eventually even into early American post revolutionary times. It deals with lots of this Zin stuff, where these poor Westerners really had a problem with, and they, in their minds, getting screwed over by the rich Easterners. And so every once in a while they would get their muskets and fight back. The chapter also talks a little bit about, that these royal governors were appointed by either the king in England or by rich people in England, and a lot of times they just tried to get rich off of the people, similar to some of the politicians nowadays. Think Blagojevich and Jesse Jackson Jr. And so one of the ways that a colonial assembly could stop this, if they thought the royal governor either sucked or was corrupt, is they just didn't have to pay a salary. They're the ones who actually would vote and give the governor his salary. And so it was kind of a flaw in the British system, where the king should have been the one that paid the royal governor's salaries, not the people in the colonial assemblies of where the royal governor was stationed. And so this flaw allowed the colonial assemblies to kind of basically extort the royal governor into doing what they wanted. Oh, a picture of fox hunting. How aristocratic and fun. And then, of course, the timeline, the chronology here. There was, in 1721, there was a very, very early version of smallpox inoculation, actually. It was, one of the very, very first kind of shots that you could get to prevent this. And you basically got a very small version of smallpox. And if you lived, good for you. Now you're immune to smallpox. But the inoculation itself oftentimes would give you full-blown smallpox, and then you died. You have here 1732, talking about Poor Richard's Almanac by Franklin. 1734, you have Jonathan Edwards, begins the Great Awakening. 1738, talks about George Whitefield, gets in the Great Awakening game. 1734 is the Zenger trial. The Paxton Boys Rebellion in 1764. The Regulator Protest in 1768. So the dates on this chronology all tie to, well, not all of them, but we'll say 2/3 of them tie to very important things that you can plan on being tested on in Unit 1 exam and definitely on the AP test. And that's it.